Good morning. A couple weeks ago, we talked about God as the lifter of our head. And there were more things that I wanted to share with you about that lesson and didn't have the time for. So this morning, the lesson is the lifter of my head, part 2. Last time we talked about Psalm 3, where David suffered in sorrow and shame and defeat because of the betrayal of his son and the overthrow of his throne. And he left Jerusalem with his head drooping low in sorrow as he wept. Yet he confidently declared in Psalm 3 to the Lord, "You are my glory and the lifter of my head." And remember, that didn't just mean God would cheer David up and end his sadness. Yes, that's part of it, but it also meant that God would restore David to his former position of glory as king on the throne. And that's why it's the same language used in Psalm 110, which is the most often quoted Old Testament passage in the New, about how God promised to lift up the head of his king. And when I say it's the most often quoted Old Testament passage in the New, specifically applied to Jesus, where he's not just a priest according to Melchizedek, but he is God's king. And God would lift the head of his king. And the ultimate fulfillment of those passages we talked about was when Jesus died with his head drooping low, bowed down on the cross. Yet 3 days later, God exalted him and restored him to his former glory as king, ending Jesus' shame, sadness, and defeat, and crowning him with victory so he could sit forever at the right hand of the throne of his Father with his head held high. What was interesting to me in this study, though, is that this language about the lifting of one's head is very rare in Scripture. It's only found in 3 places. Psalm 3, Psalm 110, and one other place that we're going to look at this morning. But in this one other place in Scripture, it introduces a very unexpected twist to the language. Look with me in Genesis 40. Genesis 40. This brings us back to the story of Joseph, who is now sitting in prison. And this whole mess started when Joseph had 2 dreams about his brothers bowing down to him, which made them even more angry and jealous of him than they were before. And so they faked his death. They sold him into slavery. And while he was enslaved, he was serving in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife came on to Joseph. And because he was a man of integrity, he resisted her advances, and it hurt her feelings. And so she decided, I'm going to lie about Joseph and tell my husband, Potiphar, that Joseph tried to make a move on me. And obviously the husband is furious, and he throws Joseph in prison. And that is where we pick up. Read with me verses 1 through 8 in Genesis 40. Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was furious with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. And he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in the master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" And then they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So the Pharaoh's chief cupbaker and chief baker had extremely important jobs. There were frequent assassination attempts against the Pharaoh, and one way to discreetly assassinate the Pharaoh is to poison his food. And so the cupbearer was in charge of guarding the drinks for the Pharaoh, and the baker was in charge of guarding the food for the Pharaoh. And part of that would be to actually taste test the food and the drink before and make sure that it was safe before giving it to Pharaoh. And because they were in the chief positions, they would be in charge of hiring staff for food preparation. And they needed to make sure that they were hiring trustworthy people who would not, attempt to poison the Pharaoh. Well, we don't really know what happened. But it's probably a fair assumption that Pharaoh got sick after his meal. And he did not know how that happened. He didn't know if it came from the food or if it came from the drinks. And so he just puts both the food and the drink guy, both of them in prison until he sort of gets to the bottom of this and figures out what happened. Well, while in prison, both of them have dreams and they're feeling dejected because there's no one to interpret them. They don't know what they mean. The dreams seem a little ominous maybe. And Joseph can tell that they are sad, which means, what about their heads? Their heads would have been drooping low. He even says to them, why are your faces so sad? So he can tell they're frowning. Okay, probably like we said last time, when you're sad, you're not usually sad with your head up. Your head just naturally goes down when you are sad. And just like Joseph had two dreams about his own future, here, by God's power, he interprets two dreams about theirs. And listen to the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream. Look in verses 9 through 15. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me. And on the vine were 3 branches, and as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to the former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. So even though his head was hanging low in sorrow over his circumstances and in shame of being in prison, Joseph says Pharaoh is going to lift your head within 3 days, which means not only is he going to cheer you up, right? You're not going to be sad anymore. You're going to be restored to your former position of glory as his cupbearer. This is the same language, right, that David used about himself in Psalm 3 and of the Messiah in Psalm 110. But there's an unexpected twist in the language when Joseph interprets the chief baker's dream. Listen to how this goes, verses 16 to 19. When the chief baker saw that he interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you. How jarring to hear this play on words here by Joseph. I mean, he takes the same phrase, lift up your head, but he assigns it a totally different meaning here. And honestly, this has always bothered me a little bit. It seems a little insensitive for Joseph to say this when you're delivering such harsh, devastating news to someone. Usually you don't use humor and irony to do it. But he says, lift up your head means he's going to lift up your head off of your body and hang you on a tree. And I've been bothered by it over the years, but I think, I don't know why I never realized this until studying this recently. Perhaps what accounts for Joseph's harshness here in his language is that the baker is actually guilty of wronging Pharaoh. I don't know why. In the past, when I've read this story, I just thought, this is just sort of a misunderstanding, and Pharaoh's really harsh. I mean, how could he kill his baker, the poor guy? This is like a misunderstanding. The baker's really a good guy, and he's wrongly in prison like Joseph is. I don't know where I got that from, why I always made that assumption, and that Pharaoh was just a really harsh master. That's why. No, I think the point is he has committed a crime worthy of death against Pharaoh. And so Joseph is pronouncing well-deserved judgment on the baker for this. Now, let me take a quick detour, and you will see in a moment where I'm going with this. But even though there were 39 separate books in the Old Testament, the Jews saw the Old Testament as one unified whole, pointing to the future hope of the Messiah. And so if the same phrase, or even just a single word was used in two different passages, even if the contexts of those passages were totally different, they would see an interconnection between those two phrases, or even just between two single words, pointing forward to greater future realities under the Messiah. It was called the Midrashic style of interpretation. The writer of Hebrews does this sometimes. For instance, in Hebrews 4, he takes the word rest from Genesis 2, where God rested after creation in the garden, and then he takes the word rest from Psalm 95, which is a totally different context, talking about the rest in the land of Canaan. And they put those two together. And what they said is, look, the rest in Psalm 95 wasn't really talking about the rest in the land of Canaan. The ultimate rest was the rest of Genesis 2 back in the garden, this eternal Sabbath rest that we would have with God that would only be made possible under the Messiah. If you ever listen to the Bible Project, Tim Mackey calls this hyperlinking, where the Jews would link multiple texts together based on a single word or phrase. Coming back to our talk this morning, I think the Jews would have absolutely seen the hyperlink between the phrase, lift up your head, of the cupbearer here in Genesis 40, and the lifter of my head in Psalm 3 and in Psalm 110. And they would have seen, okay, the same God who has the power through Joseph's interpretation of dreams to lift up the cupbearer's head and restore him to a position of glory, that same God would do the same thing for David and ultimately for the Messiah. But what they clearly did not understand was that the alternate meaning of lifting one's head given by Joseph to the baker here would also apply to the Messiah. They missed that hyperlink. And you know what? I don't blame them for that, because that thought is absolutely crazy. That thought is absolutely insane to them. They all knew that God would lift up the head of the Messiah, but no one expected God to lift the Messiah's head up off of him and hang him on a tree. But on this side of the cross, we can see so clearly the double meaning of lifting the head. And this may be where Jesus gets his idea of the double meaning of lifting in his language. Look with me in John 12, please. John 12. John 12, verse 32. Jesus says, John 12:32, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. Now to us and to the Jews at the time, lifted up from the earth sounds like a good thing. Sounds like an exaltation, a resurrection, an ascension. And it's true, even in Acts 1, in verse 9, when Jesus ascends into heaven, the text says Jesus was lifted up to heaven, and a cloud received him from their sight. Yet John tells us in the next verse, in verse 33, that when Jesus mentioned being lifted up from the earth, he was talking about his death. So Jesus, like Joseph, used a play on words. And he says to be lifted up, true, it does mean exaltation and honor and glory, but it can also mean lifted up on a cross, on a tree, in shame and humiliation. And for Jesus, it had to be both. In order to be lifted up in honor, he had to first be lifted up in shame. Now, what bothered me at first about seeing Jesus foreshadowed by the baker is that usually Joseph is the one who foreshadows Jesus. And he certainly does in Genesis 40. In fact, the typology that I see is that the chief cupbearer represents all those who are declared righteous on the day of judgment. And the chief baker represents all those who are declared wicked. And here they are judged by the truth of Joseph's words. The truth of God through Joseph acts as their judge and determines the fate of the righteous and the wicked. And I see in that a parallel to Jesus, who came to speak truth. And his words of truth would determine who is declared righteous and who is declared wicked in the final day. Look in John 12, verse 48. He even says this in John 12:48. He who rejects me and does not receive my sayings has one who judges him. The word I spoke is what will judge him at the last day. The truth of Jesus' words will be our judge on the day of judgment, just as Joseph's words to the baker and the cupbearer judged them. So yes, Jesus is foreshadowed by Joseph in this story. But if we're consistent in that typology, and the cupbearer represents the righteous, and the baker represents the wicked, then it makes perfect sense to see Jesus foreshadowed in them both. Because Jesus came as the only truly righteous man. He is the chief of the righteous. But he also came to represent sinful humanity by taking the curse of sin upon himself and to be treated as the chief of the wicked. Jesus is foreshadowed by both the cupbearer and the baker because he experienced the fate of both. In the end, like the cupbearer, Jesus was restored to his former position with God because he was found innocent, and so his head was lifted up in glory and honor and exaltation. But before that could happen, he had to become the baker and allow his head to be lifted up off of him, so to speak, and hung on a tree. And I want to be careful not to read too much into the text, but I just cannot help but notice that these two men, the baker and the cupbearer, are represented by bread and wine. And that's what their dreams were about too. And so as we partake this morning of the bread and wine of this Lord's Supper memorial, let us remember that Jesus was the only true cupbearer, the only one truly innocent. And we are and were all bakers. Yet Jesus became a baker like us so that we could become a cupbearer like him. He allowed his head to be lifted up off of him so that ours could be lifted up.